boys and girls. In this lesson, we have been learning how to create mental images to help us understand what we're reading better. If you remember in the mini lesson, we read the book with no pictures and we had to create some mental images that helped us understand the text, and that was a pretty silly book to read. Today we're going to be reading a book called The Salamander Room. And this book does have pictures. It has beautiful illustrations, but I'm not going to show you the pictures until after we think about the mental image that we're creating. All right? And like I said, this book has a lot of language that the author uses to help us paint a picture in our mind. But then the author also has beautiful illustrations, or the illustrator created beautiful illustrations to put throughout the book also. Right, so we're going to read this book together and practice creating those mental images to help us understand the text a little bit more. Right, so let's read this book called The Salamander Room. Oh, and I'm not going to show you the pictures until after we make that mental image. Sorry, I almost broke my own rule. Brian found a salamander in the woods. It was a little orange salamander that crawled through the dried leaves of the forest floor. The salamander was warm and cozy in the boy's hand. "Come live with me," Brian said. He took the salamander home. Okay, so if I close my eyes and I think about the words that the author used there, I am picturing a little boy in the middle of woods that is covered with crunchy brown leaves. Okay, and then I'm thinking of him finding the little orange salamander and picking him up in his hand and holding him very delicately, so that way he doesn't hurt the salamander. And I can picture the boy also being a little bit excited because it seems like the boy likes the salamander because he wants to take him home. And I can picture the salamander a bright orange color, but he kind of blends in with the leaves a little bit because you remember the leaves are dried. So that's kind of the thing I'm picturing in my mind. Were you picturing something similar in your mind? Let's look at the picture and see what the illustrator created. So it looks very similar to what I pictured in my mind. You can see even the salamander, like I said, he's kind of blending in. He is an orange color, but he's blending in with some of those dried leaves. All right, let's look at the next page. "Where will he sleep?" his mother asked. "I will make him a salamander bed to sleep in. I will cover him with leaves that are fresh and green and bring moss that looks like little stars to be a pillow for his head. I will bring him crickets to sing him to sleep and bullfrogs to tell him good night stories." Right, so here the little boy is talking about how he's going to make the salamander at home because his mother asked, "Where will the salamander sleep?" And he said, "I will bring him in leaves that are fresh and green." So I'm imagining leaves that were picked right from the tree, and they're fresh and green. They're not brown or they haven't changed colors, but they're fresh, like they just came in from outside. And then moss, I'm picturing that moss that grows on trees, that he's pulling some of that moss for the lizard too. I'm sorry, not the lizard, the salamander. He's pulling some of that moss to make a little pillow. So I can imagine a little moss pillow. And then I can hear in my mind the crickets singing and the bullfrogs croaking. And it kind of seems so peaceful, the little home that the boy wants to make for the salamander. What did you imagine when you heard that? I hope that you were creating that mental image to help you understand what the text was talking about, what the author was trying to tell you. And let's look at the picture the illustrator created there. And look, see, I didn't imagine it in his little drawer on his nightstand, but the illustrator just made a little salamander home right in the drawer of the little boy's nightstand. And if you look closely, there's crickets and there's a bullfrog also. Let's see what happens next. "And when he wakes up, where will he play? I will carpet my room with shiny wet leaves and water them so he can slide around and play. I will bring tree stumps into my room so he can jump up the bark and sun himself on top. And I will bring boulders that he can creep over." So here the boy said that he's going to carpet his floor. So I imagine his whole floor covered in leaves that are wet so that the salamander can slide. And then it says that he'll bring in tree stumps. So I imagine huge tree stumps in the boy's room so the lizard can crawl up on the bark and then sit at the top and lay in the sun. And then he also said that he would bring in boulders. So I imagine also big rocks that the boy is bringing in, and the lizard can creep up and over the boulders. So I'm kind of imagining this whole forest happening in the boy's room. It's like the forest and the salamander are taking over the boy's room, and his room is turning into a salamander habitat. All right, let's see what the illustrator created. There's some things that the illustrator added, like these toys in Brian's bed, that I didn't think of in my mind. I thought more of the leaves and the rocks and the tree stump. But then the illustrator added in those toys, which makes sense because this is Brian's room, and I'm sure that he has toys in there also. And if you notice, there's the little frog, the bullfrog back there too. So this book is really helping me create those mental images, and it's helping me understand the text. I think that the boy really wants to make the salamander feel at home. He will miss his friends in the forest. I will bring salamander friends to play with him. And this one didn't have a lot where we could create an image, but it looks like the salamander is missing his friends. And then Brian said that he'll bring salamander friends for him to play with. They will be hungry. How will you feed them? I will bring insects to live in my room, and every day I will catch some and feed the salamanders. And I will make little pools of water on top of the boulders so they can drink whenever they're thirsty. So Brian's mom is asking a good question. How will you feed these salamanders? And Brian's going to bring in insects. So I imagine jars of insects that the salamanders would like to eat. So that way Brian can feed all of the salamanders he's planning to bring in. And then Brian also said he'll make little pools of water on top of the boulders. So those rocks that he brought in, I'm imagining little pools of water so that way the salamanders can go and get a drink. Yeah, that's what I'm picturing. And let's see what the illustrator, what he came up with. So you see all of the insects are now in the rooms. And I wasn't imagining that. I was imagining jars of insects. So that's a little bit different than what the illustrator imagined. But the boulder has a nice pool on top of it so that way the salamanders have water to drink. So Brian's room is really becoming a salamander habitat. His whole room is kind of turning into the outdoors, which is pretty cool. The insects will multiply, and soon there will be bugs and insects everywhere. I will find birds to eat the extra bugs and insects, and the bullfrogs will eat them too. So now I imagine, like Brian's mom, that his room is filled with all of these different insects. But don't worry, Brian has a solution, because I imagine Brian letting birds in and letting lots of frogs in to eat the extra insects. So his room is becoming more and more like the outdoors. So let's see what the illustrator drew for this picture. And I hope that you created that mental image of what Brian's room might look like. You see the illustrator drew insects everywhere because Brian's room is now covered in insects. But don't worry, that bird is coming in just like I imagined in my head. And it's good too to kind of think like you are Brian, or maybe you're in Brian's room and you kind of have that idea of what his room looks like and kind of how it is. Where will the birds and bullfrogs live? I will bring trees for the birds to roost in, and I will make ponds for the frogs. So now Brian's bringing in trees. So I'm imagining trees all over his room. And he said also a pond. So in my mind, I would imagine him kind of digging a hole in his floor and making a pond, a big pond for the bullfrogs to live in. Okay, but then Brian still needs things like a bed. So his bed and all of his like dresser and toys and stuff are still around the room, but now his room has huge trees and a pond. That's kind of the mental image I'm creating. I hope that you're creating that mental image too. And this is what the illustrator came up with. So see, I imagined like Yeah, like something like that. If you can see, this is all a pond that looks like it's kind of dug into his floor. And then there's the boulder for the salamanders. And then you can see the huge trees for the birds. But all of the things that Brian needs are still in his room, like his bed and his dresser. And even on top of his dresser, there's some toys. But his room is becoming more and more like the outside. Birds need to fly. We can lift off the ceiling. They will sail out in the sky, but they will come back to my room when it's time for dinner because they will know that the biggest, juiciest insects live there. So think, he said we can lift off the ceiling. Can you imagine your room and no ceiling so that way birds could just fly freely? Wouldn't that be so cool? It'd be like your room is outside because there's no roof, right? So let's look at what the illustrator created there. So it's the same thing. It's like Brian's room. There's his walls, but there's no roof. There's no ceiling. The birds can just come and go. And now look, the trees are getting very tall too. I think that would be so cool. Except for when it rains, I wouldn't want to be in a room that was raining with no ceiling. That would not be very comfortable. But the trees, how will they grow? The rain will come through the open roof and the sun too. And vines will creep up the walls of my room. And ferns will grow under my bed. There will be big white mushrooms and moss like little stars growing around the tree stumps that the salamanders climb on. So now I'm imagining Brian's room completely covered with the vines under his bed and mushrooms and moss and the trees growing tall. I'm also imagining how his room might feel, that it might be a little bit damp from the rain or that it might be kind of warm when the sun's beating down on it. So not only are those words helping me make a picture in my mind, they're also helping me feel. I feel like it would be kind of humid in his room, and I think that it might be maybe a little bit rainy or that it might be hot when the sun's out. So the author is doing a great job with their words, helping me figure out what it looks like, but also how it might feel, even maybe how it might smell. It probably doesn't smell like a house. It probably smells like the outdoors because Brian has turned his room into the outdoors, or at least he wants to turn his room into the outdoors. And on this page, he didn't forget to mention the salamanders. So now I'm imagining the salamanders where before I kind of forgot about the salamanders, okay? Let's see what the illustrator came up with. And see, there's the salamander climbing up that tree stump. Let's keep reading. And you, where will you sleep? I will sleep on a bed under the stars, with the moon shining through the green leaves of the trees. Owls will hoot and crickets will sing, and next to me on the boulder, with its head resting on soft moss, the salamander will sleep. So Brian's room, he has imagined it turned into a forest where there's trees and there's no ceiling and there's a pond and all these wonderful things, but he will still have a bed there and he'll be able to sleep under the moon and under the stars. He'll be able to hear the owls hoot, which I'm picturing an owl, or I'm thinking about an owl hooting right now, and I can picture that sound in my mind. And he said that the salamander will still be there resting beside him on a little pillow of moss. So I imagine Brian sleeping and it being nighttime with all the stars and an owl in his room and it looking, very calm and peaceful. But then the little salamander is still sleeping right beside Brian. That's what I'm picturing in my mind. I hope that you're picturing something similar. So let's look at what the illustrator came up with there. So this author is doing an amazing job helping me picture these things in my mind. And Brian's room seems so peaceful, even though I've never been there and it probably doesn't exist. I know that it's a place that I would love to go. And then on the last page, there's no words, but there's Brian sleeping next to his salamander. All right, boys and girls, that is the salamander room, and this was a great example of how authors use different words and language to help us create those mental images, and they help us understand the book a little bit better. right? In the next lesson, you are going to hear a poem and you are going to have to draw a picture of what you think is happening in the poem. So you're going to use that poem and you're going to decide and create that mental image, and then you're going to make an illustration telling us what you think is happening in the poem. But that's the Salamander Room. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed this book as much as I did. We'll see you in the next lesson. Bye, boys and girls.